The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. But I do ask every publisher, every editor, and every newsman in the nation to re-examine his own standards and to recognize the nature of our country's peril. In time of war, the government and the press have customarily joined in an effort based largely on self-discipline to prevent unauthorized disclosures to the enemy. In times of clear and present danger, the courts have held that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. Today, no war has been declared, and however fierce the struggle may be, it may never be declared in the traditional fashion. Our way of life is under attack. Those who make themselves our enemy are advancing around the globe. The survival of our friends is in danger. And yet no war has been declared. No borders have been crossed by marching troops. No missiles have been fired. If the press is awaiting a declaration of war before it imposes the self-discipline of combat conditions, then I can only say that no war ever posed a greater threat to our security. If you are awaiting a finding of clear and present danger, then I can only say that the danger has never been more clear, and its presence has never been more imminent. It requires a change in outlook, a change in tactics, a change in missions by the government, by the people, by every businessman or labor leader, and by every newspaper. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. It conducts the Cold War, in short, with a wartime discipline no democracy would ever hope or wish to match. Nevertheless, every democracy recognizes the necessary restraints of national security. And the question remains whether those restraints need to be more strictly observed if we are to oppose this kind of attack as well as outright invasion. For the facts of the matter are that this nation's foes have openly boasted of acquiring through our newspapers information they would otherwise hire agents to acquire through theft, bribery, or espionage. That details of this nation's covert preparations to counter the enemy's covert operations have been available to every newspaper reader, friend and foe alike. That the size, the strength, the location, and the nature of our forces and weapons, and our plans and strategy for their use, have all been pinpointed in the press and other news media to a degree sufficient to satisfy any foreign power, and that in at least one case, the publication of details concerning a secret mechanism whereby satellites were followed required its alteration at the expense of considerable time and money. The newspapers which printed these stories were loyal, patriotic, responsible, and well-meaning. Had we been engaged in open warfare, they undoubtedly would not have published such items. But in the absence of open warfare, they recognized only the tests of journalism and not the tests of national security. And my question tonight is whether additional tests should not now be adopted. That question is for you alone to answer. No public official should answer it for you. No governmental plan should impose its restraints against your will. But I would be failing in my duty to the nation in considering all of the responsibilities that we now bear and all of the means at hand to meet those responsibilities if I did not commend this problem to your attention and urge its thoughtful consideration. On many earlier occasions I have said, and your newspapers have constantly said, that these are times that appeal to every citizen's sense of sacrifice and self-discipline. They call out to every citizen to weigh his rights and comforts against his obligations to the common good. I cannot now believe that those citizens who serve in the newspaper business consider themselves exempt from that appeal. I have no intention of establishing a new Office of War Information to govern the flow of news. I am not suggesting any new forms of censorship or new types of security classifications. I have no easy answer to the dilemma that I have posed and would not seek to impose it if I had one. But I am asking the members of the newspaper profession and the industry in this country to re-examine their own responsibilities, to consider the degree and the nature of the present danger, and to heed the duty of self-restraint which that danger imposes upon us all. Every newspaper now asks itself, with respect to every story, is it news? All I suggest is that you add the question, is it in the interest of national security? And I hope that every group in America, unions and businessmen and public officials at every level, will ask the same question of their endeavors and subject their actions to this same exacting test. And should the press of America consider and recommend the voluntary assumption of specific new steps or machinery, I can assure you that we will cooperate wholeheartedly with those recommendations. Perhaps there will be no recommendations. Perhaps there is no answer to the dilemma faced by a free and open society in a cold and secret war. In times of peace, any discussion of this subject and any action that results are both painful and without precedent. But this is a time of peace and peril which knows no precedent in history. It is the unprecedented nature of this challenge that also gives rise to your second obligation, an obligation which I share, and that is our obligation to inform and alert the American people, to make certain that they possess all the facts that they need and understand them as well, the perils, the prospects, the purposes of our program, and the choices that we face. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people, for I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. It means greater attention to improved understanding of the news, as well as improved transmission. And it means, finally, that government at all levels must meet its obligation to provide you with the fullest possible information outside the narrowest limits of national security, and we intend to do it. It was early in the 17th century that Francis Bacon remarked on three recent inventions already transforming the world: the compass, gunpowder, and the printing press. Now the links between the nations, first forged by the compass, have made us all citizens of the world, the hopes and threats of one becoming the hopes and threats of us all. In that one world's effort to live together, the evolution of gunpowder to its ultimate limit has warned mankind of the terrible consequences of failure. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
Stay out of New York City because the attack was considered imminent. We expected mass casualties and a possible miniature thermonuclear strike, a bomb. However, I want to be very clear. The attack was always defined as airplane hijackings and a strike on the World Trade Center.
God, I'm on the 83rd floor. What? I'm on the 83rd floor.
What's the telephone number? Where is she? You can do anything there, 4-1-2623.
Are they going to be able to get somebody up here?
Well, of course, man. We're coming up to you.
Two of us in this office. We're not ready to die, but it's getting bad.
There's no one here yet, and the floor is completely engulfed. We're on the floor, and we can't breathe.
Please hurry.
No fire for now, and no smoke, right?
Of course there's smoke.
Where are you? Which way you guys up to? We're getting there. Doesn't feel like it, man. I got one too.
It's very hot. I don't see any air anymore.
Okay.
All I see is smoke.
Smoke rises. We're on the floor. We're in a window. Can't see.
Can you stay on the line with me, please?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to die, aren't I?
No.
I'm going to die.
Ma'am, say your prayers.
Thank God the brother in from the left.
Help! Help!
Ma'am?
Help!
What the hell happened?
Oh, my God.
Oh, God! the World Trade Center. You aware of that? You have a plane that crashed into the World Trade Center in Manhattan? World Trade Center in Manhattan.
Oh my God.
No way.
Just a few moments ago, you can hear around me emergency vehicles heading towards the scene. Now, this could have been an aircraft, or it could have been something internal. It appears to be something coming from the outside due to the nature of the opening on about the 100th floor of the South Tower of the World Trade Center.
What?
The World Trade Center, tower number 1 is on fire. The whole outside of the building was just a huge explosion.
One of the scenarios in...
It wasn't in the commercial airline. That second one wasn't no commercial. No, the second one definitely. Didn't have any markings on it that I saw.
No, I didn't see any. The second one, it didn't have, like no camouflage or anything,
No emblems, no logos.
The second plane was an unmarked silver fuselage.
I'd say it was like a two-engine plane or something. But it didn't look like an airliner to me because it was black.
This one did it on purpose.
Okay.
A black plane. Yeah, we see it going around. He went. Yeah, we just saw.
The plane wasn't no airline or anything. It was a twin-engine, big gray plane.
When you saw the second one happen, what did it look like?
And it was a much smaller plane, but someone said it looked like a military plane, but I'm not sure. I don't know much about airplanes.
Mark, were you close enough to be able to see any markings on the airplane?
It definitely did not look like a commercial plane. I didn't see any windows on the sides.
No, it was a black plane. It looked like a fighter jet.
It looked like a fighter jet.
And it didn't look like a commercial jet.
It was a military plane.
Could be a drone aircraft. That's an aircraft that's guided electronically to its target without having a pilot.
The plane circle around and actually come on to the opposite side of the building and smash into the Trade Center. It was great, to be honest with you.
We watched the first explosion. As we're watching the buildings, we saw a black, very large airplane fly right into the second building. It came at it south, right in front of our eyes. It was so surreal, like a movie set.
The only other thing that was found was the engine on Murray Street, and the engine on Murray Street has been identified as either a CFM-56, CFM stands for Senecma, or the CF-6, which was a 767 engine, which was developed out of the CFM-56. But whichever one it was, the CF-6 or the CFM-56, it had to be General Electric. And unfortunately, or fortunately, United Airlines used strictly Pratt & Whitney. So that engine that you see flying off, and that engine they say is from 175, isn't from 175 because the guys whose job was to dump it off there, dumped off the wrong engine.
Things that turned to dust in midair right in front of our faces on TV.
Why did so few people see that? Because they were told to see a collapse, maybe?
It does not fall within their
learned parameters. Conventional wisdom kicks in, and it says that it's impossible to dustify a building.
The buildings turn to dust before they even reach the ground. You can actually see this happening. You can watch any of the videos from the news channels. They all show the same thing.
We thought we knew what we saw.
A plane hitting the building should not turn the buildings into dust.
We've got to start looking at this whole situation a lot differently than we have up until now.
Free your mind.
It didn't burn up, nor did it slam to the ground, but turned into dust in midair.
The 110-story tower disintegrated in just 10 seconds.
It doesn't look like a controlled demolition or a pancake effect. It looks more like a total pulverization. And it just seems like it's like a waterfall effect, where it's just dust is just accumulating and piling over on each other.
That's not a collapse. And it's not an explosion. It's a building frothing up into powder.
This is 110 stories of building turning to dust in 10 seconds.
It just seems to turn into dust.
The towers did not collapse.
They did not collapse. They were turned to dust.
The towers were not brought down, but instead were turned into dust.
We don't have a word in our vocabulary that describes that. So I've invented a new word, dustification. I kind of define it as the process of turning a solid structure into powder in midair.
Dustified.
There it goes. Wait a minute. That building's turning into dust in midair. Collapses don't do that.
The towers turned to dust. They turned to dust before they hit the ground, and that's all I'm going to say about it.
While they sat on some of the most valuable real estate in the world, after 30 years the Twin Towers had become obsolete. With each of the floors built as an open space of almost 1 acre in size, the rising cost of energy had made it extremely expensive to keep the buildings warm in winter and cool in summer. General maintenance was also very expensive compared to buildings from more recent years. In his 1999 book on the Twin Towers, Divided We Stand, author Eric Darton wrote, "When the World Trade Center was bombed in February 1993, it was already passing its prime as office space, overtaken by a generation of more recent, cybernetically smart buildings with higher ceilings and greater built-in electrical capacity. To maintain the Trade Center as Class A office space commanding top rents, the Port Authority would have had to spend $800 million rebuilding its electrical, electronic communications, and cooling systems." Furthermore, after the 1993 bombing, the tenancy had dropped dramatically, and it had been very hard to bring it back to normal levels. But the biggest problem with the Twin Towers was the large amount of asbestos they contained. Built in a time when the use of asbestos was still allowed in civil construction, at least 400 tons of this extremely dangerous material had been used to fireproof the steel structure of the buildings and to insulate hundreds of miles of pipings for water, heating, and air conditioning. Asbestos was also present in the ceiling panels, the elevator shafts, and the vinyl tiles from office floors. From a property condition assessment of the Twin Towers dated December 2000, we read, "According to Port Authority records, a total of 7 million square feet of vinyl asbestos floor tiles were installed in the World Trade Center. By the time asbestos was banned from civil construction, the Twin Towers were nearing their completion. Initially, the asbestos was encapsulated, wherever possible, to prevent the particles from being inhaled. But in the 1990s, the regulations grew tighter, and every time a simple renovation was needed, the complete removal and replacement of the asbestos was also required. At the same time, because of the health risk it posed, the cost of asbestos removal and abatement had been skyrocketing.
They didn't burn up, nor did they slam to the ground, but turned into dust in midair.
Although they were demolished in such a way as to look as if they fell, they did not fall at all.
The buildings, in fact, mostly turned to dust before they hit the ground.
You see the steel falling in midair, trailing dust. It's not hitting anything as it's flying through the air. So why is it turned to powder in midair? It's not pulverization, it's not vaporization. I call it dustification. The buildings turn to dust.
Those towers literally disintegrated. They went into dust.
How could so much steel and concrete just vaporize? Did it all turn to dust?
It's incomprehensible for somebody to see something solid turn into dust.
The buildings turn to dust in midair. If you look at it, you can see that.
You can actually see them turning to dust before they hit the ground.
It turns to dust.
That's amazing. That is amazing. I mean, just like a Star Trek thing. It just, poof, it's gone.
What we saw and what happened on 9/11 was something that we as the public had never seen before.
What happened on 9/11, I believe today it was not a controlled demolition, it was not nanothermite, and it certainly was not the pancake effect of two planes hitting a building.
There's a cluster of core columns that remains here. Watch what happens to them. They just faint. Here's Building 7, which is a 47-story building. It's like 650 feet tall, approximately. This has got to be over that.
It physically disintegrates in front of your eyes. Not concrete, but steel.
You can see all of this just frothing up into dust. And it's also blowing downward. That's about 700 feet tall. If that thing tipped over, it would take out a few blocks worth of buildings. How's it going to go straight down? You got a 700-foot hole in the ground, dropping into? If that's smoke, why is it one face only from ground to roof? That does not look like a fire pouring out a window.
Is basically not touched at all. A few little fires in it. I mean, it was weird. It was bizarre.
It blew out of one face of the building only, from bottom to top. These windows are broken. If it was smoke from a fire and it really needed to get out, why isn't it coming out these windows? If there's a traffic jam, why does it take the path of least resistance?
Destruction of the South Tower of the World Trade Center, viewed from a helicopter to the south. This particular video clip is rich in details that call the official story into question. Notice the numerous explosions on the west side of the building above the impact point. As the top 30-floor section falls, it tips to the east. It starts off intact, but then it disintegrates in midair. Gravity alone could not cause the top section to disintegrate. When an object is in free fall, there are no internal stresses. It should have hit the ground in one piece, but it didn't. Some of the debris is clearly being accelerated by forces other than gravity. These effects can be caused by late firing explosives, which can produce a white smoke trail. White smoke, consisting of aluminum oxide, is a byproduct of the thermite reaction. While producing this video, I ran across one rocket projectile I had not seen commented on before. This one stopped midair and changed directions. Even taking perspective effects into account, this projectile lost one component of momentum and gained another. That requires an impulse. Note that the rocket trail does not point back to the building, but the point where the impulse occurred.
This must have been ground zero where this thing blew up. Car after car after car, buses, completely obliterated and burned straight down to the steel.
Down below you see molten steel. Molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava.
From a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten
towers with jet fuel and burned it all up, and that does not cause a fire hot enough to melt structural steel.
My name is Gary Warner. I'm a mechanical engineer. I hold a professional certification from the Association British Columbia. I worked as in the project engineering department of the casting plant of Alcan, the aluminum company of Canada, one of the largest aluminum smelters on the planet at the time. And in that smelter, we turned aluminum oxide into aluminum, molten aluminum. Molten aluminum is silver. It's not yellow, it's silver. It looks like mercury. The yellow molten metal is indicative of molten iron. I was a bit incredulous when I learned that NIST claimed that the molten metal was aluminum. It doesn't look at all like molten aluminum. It looks like iron, molten iron. That's what it looks like. And I've seen tons of it. We used to cast this in Alcan. They still cast it. I spent 2 years casting that.
Compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers.
9/11, very quickly. This is the plane that hit the South Tower. As you can see, the bottom of this plane is not dark blue, as a United Airlines plane would be. And furthermore, it has this groove going down the middle of the fuselage, which is indicative of 767 Boeing tanker aircraft. And also, this plane has a very odd thing attached to the bottom of the fuselage here, which is not normal characteristics or normally equipment on a regular passenger aircraft. And as the plane struck the tower, just before it struck the tower, it fired this missile-like object that was burning white hot. Here you see it's from CNN, Spiegel, etc. And it opened up a hole in the building. This is just the millisecond before the plane hit the building. You can see that there's a white-hot hole in the side of the building. And what you can see is that that white-hot hole is about exactly the same size as the fuselage that's going to hit it in a minute, which means that the hole is opened up for the plane to go into the building, except for the wings. They have their own problem. Now, this is also creating a white-hot hole. It means it's extremely hot, which indicated to me that this is probably what they call a DU missile, depleted uranium. And they put this warhead, and that warhead burns in the air because it's pyrophoric. It's very, very hot. It's what they use to go into tanks and go into any armor. It's armor-penetrating bullet or missile. And it's the silver bullet in the American military right now. They use it on everything. So it looks like something like that hit. But I said, well, if that was depleted uranium, we must see it coming out the other side of the building. And son of a gun, there we see it. This little object right here, burning white hot, going very fast. There you see it against the blue sky. That's not part of the airplane. It's burning white hot and leaving behind a trail of dark oxides. And I contacted the guy that taught me about depleted uranium in California at Lawrence Livermore Labs. And this old scientist had worked on all those projects from the Manhattan Project all the way through Star Wars. And he taught me everything I knew about depleted uranium. So I asked him, Marion, I said, does this burning object, this little guy right here, does this have the characteristics of a burning DU warhead? And he said, yes, it does. So it looks like that's what happened. Now, why would they do that? Well, that object would open up the hole for the plane, and it would also create a superheated environment inside the tower on that floor, super hot, so that anything that's burnable in that floor would immediately combust into flames. Here we see some explosion, something very peculiar coming out the entry wound where the plane entered the building. We see this energetic explosion coming out. But you can see that then something exploded inside the tower. And what's interesting here is that this explosion is marked by the outside perimeter was white smoke, which may very well be indicative of thermite, because when thermite burns, it produces white smoke, which is aluminum oxide, and incredible heat. The same thing happened to the North Tower. The plane went in here, and this big explosion came out the east side of the building. One important point to understand is that both planes went directly into computer floors which contained huge banks of computers, a data center. Not where people worked, just where big boxes of computer stuff were stored, were working. This is the South Tower. And what we see here is that the South Tower, there was a tremendously energetic thermetic reaction going here, what appears to be on the 81st floor, creating that white smoke I was telling you about. And this is all documented in the reports. They talk about these puffs of white smoke that fell. Well, a thermetic reaction like that creates temperatures of about 2,500 degrees Celsius and molten iron. So this is taken at 9:52 in the morning, 51. 1 minute later, we see this cascade of molten iron pouring off the building. And this fell for 7 minutes until the building fell down. Well, the government can't explain this. Nobody can explain where this molten metal came from. The official report said, oh, it's probably the plane melted, and this is probably aluminum. Nonsense. Molten aluminum in daylight conditions looks like tinfoil. So that's not aluminum. And then, and I have to point out also that these windows are 2 feet across, about that wide across. Yet 1 cubic meter of aluminum weighs 6.5 tons. So that's a lot of stuff. So I finally found out what was on that floor, on the 81st floor, and I found out that it was Fuji Bank's computer center. And a guy that worked there told me that the strange thing was, he said that in the summer before 9/11, they would deliver these big black boxes at night, bigger than this podium here and twice as high, and they were put on the floor inside the computer room, and the people that worked there were told that these were batteries, backup batteries for the computer system. But he said the strange thing was it was never plugged in. They were never plugged in. Well, that indicates to me that that's probably where the thermite was, in those big boxes. That would make sense. Okay. And here we have then the demolition. This is after the cascade. As that went on, the tower just began to explode from the top down. Now you can see this is very energetic. And this is, you're getting material thrust out laterally. This is an explosion. This is not a collapse. That's the collapse. Now, what's interesting about this dust, this is called the dust of the World Trade Center. As I said, the buildings were reduced to dust and steel. This dust had a very strange characteristic, and that is that it contained billions and billions of tiny droplets of molten iron that look like this. This is a population that a scan, you see these little, look like tennis balls. This is what they look like up close. They're little tiny balls of iron. And billions of these tiny balls were created during the demolition of the World Trade Center. And they were formed at extremely high temperatures, above 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, during the demolition of the towers. Burning jet fuel or office fires cannot possibly produce such molten iron, but thermite can. This is why the government reports have ignored this evidence from the crime scene. Well, thermite cutter charge. These box columns like this, they held up the World Trade Center. There were 47 of them. All 47 towers had to fail at the same time, simultaneously, for the building to fall. And this one seems to have been cut with a cutter charge that made the slag drip down on the side. This is the material that was found in the World Trade Center. This, when they first found it, Niels Harrit was here, and Professor Jones in Utah. They led this team, international team, and they found this material in the dust, and this material was a bilayered material that when they heated it up to 430 degrees Celsius, it went off with a bang and released more energy per gram than any known explosive. So they found out this wasn't paint, this was super thermite, called the smoke of the World Trade Center. Smoke compared to dust. This is what rose from the burning pile. Now the pile burned until Christmas of 2001 because they put so much of this thermetic material in the World Trade Center that it just kept cooking off down below the surface. And it made this very thin blue smoke. Now the Environmental Protection Agency, who's supposed to be the watchdog for the environment, told the people of New York the air was safe to breathe. In fact, it was very, very dangerous to breathe this stuff because this smoke contained huge amounts of nanoparticles. Particles that are so small that if you inhale them, they don't get stuck in your throat or your nose or your capillaries. They're so small that they permeate every membrane of the human body until they get to the nucleus of the human cell. There they lodge themselves in the nucleus, and then they start messing with the human system and cause very serious cancers and Parkinson's disease. So that these firefighters who walked on the pile, they were inhaling this stuff. They're like smoking it. And 1,600 of these men have already died of cancer. And there are 5,700 more who are dying of cancer. So you can see there are more people who have been made ill and dying from the smoke than from the crime itself. We found beneath the rubble molten metal, molten steel in the molten state, dripping. And the firefighters said you'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails like you're in a foundry, like lava, like a volcano. And I called up the American guy who was involved, only one American guy of all four, who was involved in cleaning it up, and he told me that they got down to the bedrock of Manhattan. There were 7 basements, and when they got down to the very basement, the bedrock of Manhattan, they found molten steel in the molten state. And I called up another contractor from Controlled Demolition, and I asked him, did you hear about this? And he said, yes, it was. Bottom at the basements of 1, 2, and 7. And I said, how can you explain molten steel, molten iron in the molten state 5 weeks afterwards under a pile of rubble? And he said, think of all the paper that fell down the elevator shafts. And this is another anomaly, a very important one. This is building number 6, World Trade Center 6. Building 7 is here, building 1 is here. They haven't fallen yet. The ground is all very still clean, normal. But this building is burning like a forest fire. Something happened to this building at about 9:03. At about the exact same time as the South Tower was hit, something exploded here. And this is called the U.S. Customs House. And what we see that after one of the buildings has collapsed, you can see that the ground is now very littered, and you see the building has been destroyed. There's a big explosion out this side, and the firemen couldn't put it out. Well, what happened to Building 6? Well, this is Building 6 right here, and in the middle of the building, there's a huge explosion. Something happened from down below in the sub-basement level. That's where 7 was. This is where 1 was. Well, what was in this basement of Building 6? That was where they had all the evidence vault. That's where they had the big vault where they kept all the evidence for the big crimes of the 1990s like Enron and WorldCom and George Bush's $200 billion Black Eagle Trust Fund that he used to take down the Soviet Union. All the paper, all those documents, all that evidence was in that basement. And as we now know, the bad guys had gone into that vault the night before, cleaned it out, and then blew it up in the morning. So that the devastation, the bombing of the vault was done to hide the fact that the vault had been robbed the night before. So it's like a Russian doll. It's a crime within a crime within a crime.
In the Twin Towers, part of the supporting columns had been moved towards the exterior wall, creating a large column-free space available for rental. For this reason, the external structure had literally become a grid of steel columns made with prefabricated blocks that were mounted on site. These are the thin steel nerves mentioned by debunker Alberto Angela, 244 steel columns placed approximately 2 feet apart, which supported 40% of the weight of the towers. Far from being 2 empty parallelepipeds, the internal structure was comprised of 47 steel columns, so long and sturdy that a special factory in Japan had to be built in order to assemble them. It was the core structure to support the majority of the weight of the building, 60% of it, and not the external structure. The core structure, seen on the left, is what the 9/11 Commission has called a hollow steel shaft. This is the same core structure near the base of the tower. The core structure was an actual, extremely robust steel skyscraper built within another skyscraper. The core structure housed the stairs, the elevators, and all other services needed for the functioning of the tower. The inner walls of the core structure were made of simple layers of sheetrock. A long series of steel trusses connected the core structure to the external one and supported the floors. The floors were also prefabricated rectangular pieces covered by a thin layer of concrete. The internal and external structure connected through an umbrella-like structure called a hat truss, which kept together the towers and bound them from above. The idea that this kind of structure is fragile and therefore no longer used after 9/11 is disproven by the new Building 7 built by Larry Silverstein. A strong central structure supports the majority of the weight of the building. Long steel beams support the floors and connect the core structure to the external one, allowing for a large column-free space in between, a very similar concept to the one used in the Twin Towers. Most importantly, the debunkers forget to mention that the Twin Towers were built with a structural redundancy of 3 to 5 times the weight they were meant to support.
This structure was capable of holding 3 to 5 times the weight.
These buildings are built to handle several times the load above them.
Now, I mean, those might have been the two sturdiest, strongest buildings on the planet. Now, majority of buildings get most of their strength from the core, around like the elevator shaft. That's where the heaviest steel will be, and it'll come up the middle of the building. And it creates like a spine. So this is where most of the strength from the building comes. Now, if you look at the Twin Towers, they were built like that, like every other building. They were also built with an exoskeleton of some of the heaviest steel in any building in the whole city. To make even anything other than a dent, let alone a hole that size in those buildings, you'd have to drive an aircraft carrier into them. A plane like that would just shred itself like paper. It would barely even enter the building. The majority of it would crumple and would just fall down to the ground.
For a 3 to 4 mile radius, which has now been completely sealed off and is being treated, according to the FBI, as a crime scene. This is one of those cases where the pictures really do tell the story, that sort of the most horrifying aspect of this particular crash scene is how little debris is visible. That's really all you see is a large crater in the ground and just tiny, tiny bits of debris. There has been at least one report that the investigators out there, and there are hundreds of them, as I said tonight, have found nothing larger than a phone book.
6 minutes the passengers had been unable to enter the cockpit. Why didn't the hijackers continue flying towards the Capitol? And even if they thought they couldn't make it to Washington, why didn't they try to crash the plane onto a small town nearby? Why crash the plane in an empty field where they knew they could not kill any more victims than those that were already on the plane with them? Maybe a less fictional explanation for Flight 93 is the one offered by Vernon Gross, author and former NTSB investigator.
The role the government plays in times of stress, how they view the public. Can the public stand the truth? Or shouldn't we need a legend at this point. We need a really neat story of reacting against such a dastardly act as was happening. So it's really nice and convenient to think of the Beamer story, let's roll, and that becomes just like the Alamo. And it's just one of those legends, and I think there'll be a lot of pressure to let the legend stay where it is.
No proof whatsoever that the terrorists boarded the plane, nor that they were ever in the cockpit. An alleged hijacker who could not have flown an airliner in the way that Flight 93 was flown. A false, concurrent hijacking that called the attention away from the real one. No proof whatsoever that Flight 93 crashed in the field near Shanksville. An extended debris field which flatly disproves the official version of the crash and suggests that the plane broke up in mid-air instead. An unexplained small white jet leaving the area right after the impact. And the fact that the passengers who called from their cell phones could not have been on that plane to begin with, which strongly suggests their revolt was a scripted, fictional event intended to fuel a prefabricated legend.
Slide of the presentation. This is the hole in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where we're told that a large Boeing body went into this hole. Now I have to tell you, this hole is only 20 feet across, between 20 and 24 feet. That's like 8 meters. 8 times 3 is 24. Yeah, 7 or 8 meters across. And the coroner, Wally Miller, he came to this hole. He looked at it, he said, I stopped being a coroner after 20 minutes, there were no bodies. The mayor of Shanksville went there and he said, there's no plane here. So where was the plane? The actual debris field was about a quarter mile in here, further in the woods. Now, I went to the local paper here in Somerset as a journalist. I said, I want to ask you how you covered this story. They said, okay, Mr. Bolden, come in on Wednesday at 3 o'clock. I came in Wednesday at 3 o'clock. They took me into the back office. They had a brand new $2 million building. I said, wow, this is great. And they sit me down in an office with an American military intelligence officer named Levernight. I said, why am I talking to you? He said, I've been seconded to the paper to answer your questions. I said, okay, very good. Can you tell me why there's no evidence of an airplane in this hole? And he said, well, it's very simple. He said, the ground was very soft. And he said, when the plane came very fast, the ground liquefied and swallowed the plane. But he said, but one wing bounced a half mile in the woods. What's up with that? Well, that's because they want to explain why the actual debris field was over here. You see, nobody cares about this hole. They're all out there. And then I contacted the man who owned the cabins in the woods where the debris field was actually located, and he was a Lutheran minister. His name was Hoover. And I said, Reverend Hoover, can you tell me why you have not been upfront and direct with the American people and told us that the actual debris field was on your 9-acre parcel in the woods? And he said, I was just trying to cooperate. That's what everybody says in Shanksville.
You know, let's roll, crashing a drink cart into the cabin, where the pilots are alleged to have called that Allah Akbar, which of course in Arabic means God is great, God is great.
Normally, a plume of thick black smoke rises to the sky and continues to burn until all the fuel is consumed. But instead of being faced by something like that, this is what the people in Shanksville saw.
This is what we saw.
Das ist das, was wir gesehen haben. Sieht fast aus wie ein Pilz.
It looked like a mushroom cloud, he said, but under the cloud there is no plume of black smoke rising to the sky, and the mushroom shape is the classic result of a bomb explosion. The same local reporter also noticed the absence of smell from burnt jet fuel and the odor of scorched earth instead.
And there's a very strong odor of the scorched earth. This is the only way I can describe it. It doesn't smell like jet fuel. It smells like... Kendall, how do you describe it? Just burned earth. Burned earth. It smells like burned earth.
The grass next to the hole also indicates there was no fire after the explosion, as it appears perfectly dry and untouched all around. Some have suggested that this is only the initial explosion, and that the plume of black smoke hasn't started to rise yet. But this hypothesis is disproven by this video, taken by a local amateur shortly after the explosion took place.
Crash over on Lambertsville Road.
As one can see, the initial cloud floats in the air, but the typical plume of black smoke rising from below is not there.
Don't know anything.
If we fast forward the video, we can see that the situation doesn't change much. After more than 1 minute, the initial cloud is still there, but there is no black smoke whatsoever rising from below. Question. Since the plane was carrying 8,000 to 10,000 gallons of fuel at the time of impact, can you explain why there is no plume of black smoke rising from the ground after the initial explosion? To explain how different parts of debris could end up several miles away from the crash site, even though the plane is supposed to have hit the ground in one piece. William Bunch was a reporter for the Pittsburgh Gazette.
I gathered all the information I could and quickly learned that there were a lot of things about the crash of Flight 93 that didn't really add up right away. The fact that debris fell on this lake a couple miles away at the same time that the plane was crashing.
The lake Bunch is talking about is Indian Lake, which is located a couple of miles southeast of the crash site. According to the debunkers, there is a valid explanation for there was only a light breeze gently moving the air all around. The very cloud from the explosion, as we have seen before, practically didn't move for over 1 minute. Secondly, it wasn't just small pieces of paper that were found. From the Pittsburgh Tribune we read, by Wednesday morning, crash debris began washing ashore at the marina. Witness John Flegel said there was something that looked like a rib bone amid pieces of seats, small chunks of melted plastic, and checks. In any case, the problem is not limited to Indian Lake, which is 2 miles away from the crash site. Debris from the plane was found as far as 8 miles away, near New Baltimore. This is the map of the debris field published by the Pittsburgh Tribune. CNN also reported the secondary field, confirming that the debris belonged to Flight 93.
Well, Darren, in the last hour or so, the FBI and the state police here have confirmed that they have cordoned off a second area about 6 to 8 miles away from the crater here where this plane went down. This is apparently another debris site, which raises a number of questions. Why would debris from the plane, and they identified it specifically as being from this plane, why would debris be located 6 miles away? Could it have blown that far away? Seems highly unlikely. And as to...
And we took off out of the building. As we were coming out from the office out through the building, the ground shook and we heard, big boom. Looked over and saw the big ball of fire.
Flegel later told other people about the lights flickering.
I was in Atlanta, and I was sitting there talking to another guy, and I was explaining to him about whenever we were standing in the office and the lights flickered and everything. And as soon as he heard me say that, he immediately stopped me and he said, "Well, I'm retired from the Air Force." He said, "That plane was shot down." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because whenever the lights flickered, they zapped the radar frequency on everything before they shoot."
The mayor of Indian Lake also remembers the power going off just before the crash.
Our power had gone off, and then we felt a tremor. It sounded like a missile came across our house. I mean, they were going that fast.
The mayor of Shanksville, Ernie Stuhl, had something interesting to say. "I know of 2 people, I will not mention names, that heard a missile," Stuhl said. "They both live very close, within a couple of 100 yards. This one fellow served in Vietnam, and he says he's heard them, and he heard one that day." As far as we know, there are no witnesses who saw fighter jets near Flight 93 at the time of the crash. There are, however, some witnesses who saw a small, unmarked white plane which flew over the area just before the crash.
I was just driving along here. It was a beautiful day. Had my window open, had the stereo on, and when I got up here almost to the stop sign, this small white plane, at the time, that's what I thought it was, went over top of me. It was so smooth, and it just glided right over me, just like that. And then I ducked, and when I looked up again, then it just banked to the right and went over and went down behind those trees.
Something caught my eye, and here was a white plane, and it was coming from the crash site area.
The debunkers maintain that there is no mystery behind the white plane. It was a corporate jet, they say, which air traffic controllers had asked to take a look on the ground after they realized they had lost Flight 93.
There was, in fact, a little white jet that was seen in the area after Flight 93 crashed. A number of witnesses saw it. It was a little Dassault Falcon corporate jet that was flying to a nearby airport. And what happened is once air traffic control knew they had lost Flight 93, they asked the nearest aircraft to go over the area and actually radio back exact coordinates for the crash site.
No.
Susan McElwain, however, remembers seeing the white plane before the crash, not after.
About 11:30 that night, the FBI came, wanted to talk to me. They kept asking me how big the plane was. I said the plane, it was small, wasn't much bigger than my van that I saw, and that it went over top of me. And I said, you want to make sure maybe it was ours and not somebody else's. And then that's when he did seem to get a little nicer. Told me that it was a white Learjet. Someone was taking pictures. I said, before the crash? And he says, well, we got to go.
John Flegel also saw the mysterious plane. Since Flegel arrived on the spot within a minute from the crash, the corporate jet sent by the air traffic controllers would not have had time to descend over the area yet, while the mystery plane was already getting away from the spot into the blue sky.
We got there, like I said, probably within 45 seconds or a minute of impact. We were there. We were there before any firemen, any paramedics, or anybody. We were on site. When we got there, there was a plane flying up above, and he was smart. He flew straight for the sun, so you couldn't look at it and see exactly what type of plane or if it was a fighter or what it was. But we caught a glimpse of it, and as he was swinging, he was basically traveling in the same direction as the plane.
In truth, this heroic gesture by the passengers has been refuted by the 9/11 Commission itself. It was the hijackers, wrote the commission, and not the passengers, who chose to intentionally crash the plane in Shanksville.
But the Pentagon, I now know from interviewing eyewitnesses, expected a terrorist attack on the building that morning, but with explosives of some kind. Bomb-sniffing dog teams were at the Pentagon Metro stop at least as early as 7:30 a.m. I've personally interviewed a Fort Monmouth TDY auditor named Michael Nielsen, as well as the very famous Army area survivor April Gallup, for 2 hours with under oath testimony on videotape. And they both stated that there were bomb-sniffing dog teams in the Metro stop. So the Pentagon expected some kind of an attack, apparently with explosives, that the dog teams were sniffing for that moment. I was walking on the Pentagon's innermost corridor across the courtyard when the incident happened. I heard 2 loud booms, one large, one smaller, and the shockwave threw me against the wall. This is one of many photographs that were originally from the Department of Defense that are available on the web. Mechanical engineer Michael Meyer has stated it is physically impossible for the C-ring wall to have failed due to the impact of plane debris of any kind in a clean, neat circle. Like the one seen here at the inside of the C-ring is the signature of a shaped charge explosive, and definitely cannot be, he said it was impossible, from an impact from any kind of plane debris. Meyer spent years in aerospace, structural design, and the design and use of shaped charge explosives. If a plane or any object, any impactor, would come in at an oblique angle, which the official story says, and goes diagonally through 3 rings, that you're not going to have a perfectly round exit hole. If it's the front of a fuselage or even a round engine, it would have to impact coming perpendicular to the wall. The official story, of course, says that there is a single exit hole on the inside of the C-ring. This is a graphic taken from the Washington Post immediately after 9/11 from Pentagon sources, DoD sources itself. There are 3 exit holes listed from the Pentagon's own immediate sources to the Washington Post after 9/11, not just one. This is an aerial photograph that the Pentagon provided to all the media right after 9/11. You can see it on the web. This is the so-called official exit hole right here. But there are 2 others that in turn perfectly match these 3 so-called exit holes from the Pentagon's own release data, and here it says exit holes, plural. The one and most famous outside explosion in the 5 famous frames from the 2 videotapes of the security cameras in the parking lot of the Pentagon that the videotapes were released in the Musawi trial in August of 2006. The 85 videos that were confiscated by the FBI, there was an FOIA request. The FBI FOIA officer was honest and did an analysis of those 85 videotapes and came back to the person who requested it that there were only 2 of the 85 that in any way could be interpreted as showing an impact on the building, and those are the 2, and they do not show a plane.
Everyone. The notification gets broadcast out to all the regions.
During the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the vice president, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, do the orders still stand? And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
Mineta assumed, he said, that they were orders to have the aircraft shot down. But no aircraft approaching Washington was shot down. Mineta's interpretation also made the young man's question unintelligible, given the fact that the airspace over the Pentagon is categorized as forbidden, meaning that commercial aircraft are never permitted in it, plus the fact that the 2 hijacked planes had already crashed into the Twin Towers. The expected orders, if an unidentified plane were approaching the airspace, would have been to shoot it down. Had Cheney given those orders, there would have been no reason for the young man to ask if the orders still stood. His question made sense only if the orders were to do something unexpected, not to shoot it down. The official story is rendered especially dubious by its claim that the Pentagon was struck by a Boeing 757 flown by Al-Qaeda's Hani Hanjour. As the title of a New York Times story revealed in 2002, Hanjour, who had been taking lessons in a single-engine plane, was known as a trainee noted for incompetence, about whom an instructor said he could not fly at all. And yet on September 11, 2001, before Hanjour had been declared by authorities to have been the pilot of the plane that hit the Pentagon, a Washington Post story said, just as the plane seemed to be on a suicide mission into the White House, the unidentified pilot executed a pivot so tight that it reminded observers of a fighter jet maneuver. Aviation sources said the plane was flown with extraordinary skill. A Post story the following year stated, aviation experts concluded that the final maneuver, American Flight 77, was the work of a great talent.
A Pentagon mass casualty exercise, or MASCAL, envisioned a scenario in which a passenger jet hit the Pentagon. Army medics, the Arlington Fire Department, and other emergency responders participated in the drill. In May 2001, another Pentagon mass casualty exercise tested responses to a passenger jet crashing into the Pentagon's courtyard. This time, the Tri-Service DiLorenzo Healthcare Clinic and the Air Force Flight Medicine Clinic participated in the training. Lieutenant Colonel John Felizio, Deputy Commander for Administration of the DiLorenzo TRICARE Health Clinic, later remarked, "You know, it was kind of eerie. The scenario we had for these MASCALs was very similar to what actually happened. Our scenario for both MASCALs was a plane flying into the Pentagon courtyard." Then, in August 2001, just 1 month before 9/11, yet another Pentagon mass casualty exercise practiced building evacuation. As General Lance Lord, commander of Air Force Space Command, later noted, purely a coincidence, the scenario for that exercise included a plane hitting the building.
Do we want to think about scrambling aircraft?
Oh, God, I don't know.
That's a decision somebody's going to have to make probably in the next 10 minutes.
Everybody just left the room.
9:38, Arlington, Virginia. Hani Hanjour allegedly executes a 330-degree turn at 530 miles per hour, descending 7,000 feet in 2.5 minutes to crash American Airlines Flight 77 into the ground floor of the Pentagon.
The airplane could not possibly have flown at those speeds which they said it did without going through what they call a high-speed stall. The airplane won't go that fast and start pulling those high G maneuvers at those bank angles.
Its final approach took it directly across Interstate 395. Knocking light poles out of the ground and bouncing off of the lawn before impact. Regardless, air traffic controllers at Dulles International Airport that were tracking Flight 77 all thought that it was a military plane. Second, the light poles. On November 22, 2004, a private jet en route to Houston to pick up George Bush Sr. clipped a single light pole and crashed a minute away from landing at Houston's Hobby Airport. The wing ripped off upon impact, scattering debris over 100 yards. And yet, Flight 77 managed to tear 5 light poles completely out of the ground without damaging either the wings or the light poles themselves. Instead, they seem to have just popped out of the ground. Third, you only have to look at the photos from that day to realize that whatever hit the Pentagon did not bounce off the lawn. If Flight 77 had crash landed and skidded into the Pentagon, it would have looked like this. Instead, it looked like this, without a single scratch on the lawn. Fourth, why is there absolutely no trace of Flight 77? The official explanation is that the intense heat from the jet fuel vaporized the entire plane. Indeed, from these pictures, it seems that there is absolutely no trace of a Boeing 757. But if the fire was hot enough to incinerate a jumbo jet, then how can investigators identify 184 out of 189 people found at the Pentagon? The Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, which was responsible for the task, was also responsible for identifying the dead in Shanksville. Titanium has a melting point of 1,688 degrees Celsius. Jet fuel, also known as kerosene, is a hydrocarbon, which can retain a constant temperature of 1,120 degrees Celsius after 40 minutes, but only if the fuel is maintained. The fuel would have burned off immediately upon impact. Therefore, it is scientifically impossible that 12 tons of steel and titanium was vaporized by kerosene. Likewise, the two engines should have been found relatively intact at the Pentagon. Instead, there was a single turbojet engine approximately 3 feet in diameter found inside the building. The second identifiable piece of debris was allegedly a piece of the fuselage. Skeptics have claimed that this is proof that Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, but this piece could have come from any American Airlines plane. And why is it not singed or scratched after a 530 mile/hour impact and the subsequent fireball? The third piece of debris was a diffuser case. Let's look a little closer at the diffuser case of a 757. Do you see the triangular bezels around the openings? Those are nowhere to be found on the case found at the Pentagon. The remainder of the debris was light enough to have been carried by hand. If Flight 77 was vaporized on impact, it would be the first time in aviation history. For example, August 15th, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522, a Boeing 737 en route to Athens, Greece, crashed into a hillside at full speed. 121 passengers, all dead. Fire. Tail sections. Wing sections. Engines. Cockpit. Bodies. Fifth, why is the damage to the Pentagon completely inconsistent with a Boeing 757? He's 5 feet long, 44 feet high, has a 124-foot wingspan, and weighs almost 100 tons. Are we supposed to believe that it disappeared into this hole without leaving any wreckage on the outside? Why is there no damage from where the wings, or the vertical stabilizer, or the engines would have slammed into the building? Remember how big the engines were? If 6 tons of steel and titanium slammed into the Pentagon at 530 miles per hour, they would bury themselves inside the building, leaving 2 very distinct imprints. And yet, the only damage on the outside of the Pentagon is this single hole, with no damage from where the engines would have hit. Why are the windows next to the hole completely intact? Why are the cable spools directly in front of the hole completely untouched? And as for the inside of the Pentagon, there's another hole, approximately 16 feet in diameter, found on the other side of the C-ring, 3 rings from the impact. For that hole to have been caused by Flight 77, the Boeing would have had to smash through 9 feet of steel-reinforced concrete. The nose of a commercial airliner is composed of lightweight carbon. This is what usually happens to the nose of a commercial airliner in a plane crash. If the nose caused this hole, where's the rest of the debris from the plane? So what could blow a 16-foot hole in the outer ring of the Pentagon, smash through 9 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, and leave another 16-foot hole? A cruise missile. This is what Slobodan Milosevic's residence in Belgrade looked like after a Tomahawk cruise missile had hit it. See any similarities? Sixth, the eyewitnesses. Some saw a huge 100-ton commercial airliner
to a standstill, and I looked off. Looked out my window. I saw this plane, a jet, American Airlines jet, coming.
Some saw a small 8 to 20 passenger commuter plane.
Saw what looked to be maybe a 20-passenger corporate jet, no markings on the side, coming in at a shallow angle like it was landing right into the side of the Pentagon.
And some saw a United States military helicopter.
He said that he saw a helicopter circle the building. He said that it appeared to be a U.S. military helicopter and that it disappeared behind the building where the helicopter landing zone is, and that he then saw a fireball go into the sky.
So who's telling the truth? Take this into consideration. April Gallup was working in the Pentagon's west side when it was hit. In Jim Mars's book, Inside Job, April claims, while in the hospital, men in suits visited her more than once. They never identified themselves or what agency they worked for. They didn't tell her what to say, just made suggestions. For example, to take the compensation money and shut up. They also kept insisting that a plane hit the building. They repeated this over and over. But I was there, and I never saw a plane, or even debris from a plane. I figured this story is to brainwash people. So if a Boeing 757 didn't hit the Pentagon, then what did? Eyewitnesses inside and outside the building were thrown to the ground by what they described as a shockwave. Even the Sheraton Hotel, 1.6 miles away, was rocked by the blast. A number of military personnel at the Pentagon specifically mentioned smelling cordite. Cordite and jet fuel have two very distinct smells. Cordite is a compound used in ammunition which is comprised of nitroguanidine, nitrocellulose, and nitroglycerin. It is cool burning, produces little smoke and no flash, but produces a strong detonation wave. And eyewitnesses described a bright, silvery flash. Jet fuel combustion, i.e., the planes that struck the Twin Towers, is bright yellow at best. Watch this. A massive smoldering fireball. No silvery flash, no shockwave. And at the Pentagon, a tiny, bright, silvery flash, which shakes nearby buildings. Whatever it was, it might have been related to the two planes that were in the air after the crash. The first one was uniformly identified as a C-130. The second plane was an unmarked white plane flying over Washington, D.C.
A white plane, a very big jet, was flying in an unusual pattern near the White House over Lafayette Park very slowly. It made one circle, and then we have not seen it since. But again, it's only speculation, but most people say that since flights have been cleared from U.S. airspace and it was a totally white plane, looked unusual to all of us, that it was a government plane of some kind.
7th, surveillance cameras from a gas station, Sheraton Hotel, and the Virginia Department of Transportation captured the entire thing. However, the FBI was there within minutes to confiscate the tapes, including a warning for the employees not to discuss what they had seen. If the government wishes to prove once and for all that Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, all they would have to do is release one of those tapes. Instead, they released 5 frames from a camera across the heliport, even though none of them show a 757. And is it merely a coincidence that the Pentagon was hit in the only section that was renovated to withstand that very same kind of attack? And that Donald Rumsfeld was safe in his office on the opposite end of the building? If the government has nothing to hide, why are they so afraid to answer a few questions or release a few videos?
All the debunkers have to show for Flight 77 is a small piece of wreckage carrying an American Airlines serial number. But this piece could have been placed by anyone onto the grass after the impact. In fact, unidentified men in suits were seen meddling with the debris right after the impact, in direct violation of the rules of a crime scene. A contractor who was only 100 yards away from the point of impact stated, "It was DPS, the guys in the black coats. They were here right then and there. That's what I don't understand. Where did they come from? Maybe they knew something. I don't know." The debunkers claim that the witnesses' accounts are more than sufficient to identify the airplane.
Hundreds of people saw an American Airlines jet fly into that building.
But it's presumable that if anyone wanted a different airplane to look like an American Airlines aircraft, they would have at least thought of painting the fuselage with the same colors.
From my office,
process, I was able to see a white jet, like a Gulfstream type commuter jet, I guess.
Omar, you say this was a smaller plane, 10 to 15 passengers maybe?
No es muy grande.
No es muy grande.
It's not like too big, it's just...
¿Tú sabes los aviones comerciales?
It's like business airplane.
Like a business jet.
Yeah.
It looked like a commuter plane, 2-engine, come down from the south, real low, proceed right on and crashed right into the Pentagon.
And are you fairly sure that it was what we sometimes describe and recognize as a small commuter plane?
Yes, it was.
By the witnesses' accounts alone, it's impossible to establish what kind of airplane it was. One would expect to find a situation similar to this. What immediately stood out instead was the absence of large, identifiable pieces of debris which are usually found after the crash of an airliner. Bob Pugh was the first professional cinematographer to arrive on site.
No one was in control of the area. I had free reign. And there's a lot of debris in the foreground of those videos. Again, it's very small pieces. I mean, I'm standing on pieces, a dinner plate or smaller in size. All the while, I'm looking for wreckage, and I can't find a piece of anything that I recognize. I can't see the tail. I can't see the wheels. I can't see the engines. There's no chairs. There's no luggage.
According to the official version, the plane approached in a low trajectory, clipping 5 light poles from the nearby intersection. Slightly tilted to the left, it hit a trailer parked outside the building with the bottom of the right wing, and then impacted the facade at an angle of 42 degrees. Most of the plane penetrated the facade and proceeded inside the building on a diagonal course, causing destruction as it was being destroyed. The fuselage pierced through the outer wall of the C-ring, producing this round-shaped exit hole 10 to 12 feet wide. There are, however, many problems with this version of the events. The first one is the actual wingspan of a Boeing 757. Most of us remember the facade of the Pentagon after it had collapsed. But before it collapsed, right after the impact, this is what the building looked like. This series of pictures was taken by a Navy photographer shortly after the impact. There doesn't seem to be enough damage for a Boeing 757 to have penetrated the building almost in full. Using the best part from each image, a digital expert has created this composite picture, which has become the universal tool of reference for anyone involved in the debate. The composite picture shows an almost continuous opening at ground level, about 90 feet wide. The damage extends to the second floor, with an entry hole about 15 feet wide. This is enough, maintain the debunkers, to have accommodated most of the plane inside the building.
That gash in the E-ring was about 90 feet across. The wingspan of the plane was about 124 and change. That punched the hole into the building.
It is true, the wingspan of a 757 is 124 feet. As shown in this animation, the left wing should have also destroyed these 2 windows to the left of the opening. But the whole segment to the left of the opening doesn't seem to have been hit by a wing traveling at 500 miles per hour. The window's wooden frames are still in place, and the glass seems to have been broken from the ensuing explosion, not from the impact itself. The limestone covering the facade has fallen off, but the bricks underneath appear practically untouched. By the same projected angle, the right wing should have impacted the facade all the way to this column on the second floor.
Exhibit G. No forensic evidence. The limited number of aircraft parts found at the site were never identified as coming from N644AA. The FBI claims there was no reason to identify the parts, as they never felt the aircraft identity was in question. DNA analysis was claimed to be performed. However, DNA evidence does not determine aircraft identification. DNA evidence determines the person who the DNA belongs to. It does not determine the performance of an aircraft, nor what type of parts may or may not have been installed on an aircraft, or any modifications which may or may not have taken place. DNA chain of custody is also in question. Citizen investigators have taken it upon themselves to record and gather witness statements firsthand. Many witnesses, including Pentagon police officers, observed the aircraft which is claimed to have caused the damage at the Pentagon on a path which is physically and aerodynamically impossible to have caused the damage for any conventional aircraft. Citizen Investigation Team interviewed witnesses and crucial vantage points to the attack. All of them corroborate each other as observing the aircraft on a flight path which is irreconcilable with the damage. Detailed analysis and recorded interviews can be found in Citizen Investigation Team National Security Alert and Pilots for 9/11 Truth, 9/11, Attack on the Pentagon. Some witnesses also state they saw the aircraft fly over the Pentagon immediately after the explosion at the building.
A lot of cameras around the Pentagon. If you look at the Pentagon, you can see that there's cameras on each corner. There's cameras at some of the businesses around the Pentagon. And we know in those cases, the tapes were confiscated immediately by the FBI within hours of the event.
When a Freedom of Information Act requesting all the videos covering the impact zone was filed, the FBI agent in charge of the tapes responded, "The FBI possessed 85 videotapes that might be potentially responsive to plaintiff's FOIA request. But," concluded the agent, "I determined that only one videotape showed the impact of Flight 77 into the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. This is the tape we have all seen many, many times." The FBI could have released all the videos anyway, just to allow the public to see by themselves what was actually shown in each of them. But for some reason, they preferred to keep them under wraps. Later on, in 2006, the DoD released the entire sequence from which the 5 frames had been extracted. The time-lapse sequence runs at approximately 1 frame per second, and it shows the moments leading up to the impact, the large explosion, and a billowing fire that ensued. Unfortunately, the video does not show the airplane in transit. All we can see in the frame preceding the explosion is what appears to be the tail of an airplane followed by a trail of white smoke. But the body of the plane remains covered by this concrete column standing in the foreground. The Department of Defense also released a second video, taken by a different camera from the same parking lot. The second camera was actually located in the very column that obscured the view of the plane in the first video. This aerial shot of the Pentagon shows the actual location of the 2 cameras. The second camera faces in the same direction as the first, and it offers a clear, unobstructed view of the same field of action. By using the moment of the explosion, we can synchronize the 2 cameras with absolute frame-by-frame accuracy. By synchronizing the 2 cameras, we notice that the second video begins earlier than the first, while the first lasts longer than the second. This leaves us with a middle comment section of about 100 frames, which are perfectly synchronized with each other. From the moment the police car moves on, the action proceeds in an identical manner both in the frames preceding the explosion and in those following the explosion. Especially in the second part of the videos, after the explosion, we can verify how each couple of frames depicts exactly the same action by looking at the shape of the billowing smoke. This confirms that the 2 cameras were operating in perfect synchronization. This is only to be expected. After all, the 2 cameras were controlled by a centralized recording system called multiplexer, or TLR. There is, however, one pair of frames from the 2 videos that shows a completely different action from one another. They happen to be the 2 frames in which the plane travels across the lawn. It's frame 23 in the relative count. As the first video showed the tail and the trail of smoke, we would expect the second camera placed in this concrete column to show the entire body of the plane in the same position. It does not. In the corresponding frame, camera 2 shows only the tip of the plane entering frame from the right-hand corner. But how can the nose of the plane be behind the tail at the same moment in time? The synchronization system allows for a maximum fluctuation between the 2 cameras, or margin of error, of 1/30th of a second. Given that the plane is traveling at 750 feet per second, the maximum possible fluctuation between the 2 cameras would translate into a difference of a mere 25 feet in the position of the plane. A 757 is 155 feet long. Even calculating the perspective due to the diagonal path, this is far from sufficient to explain the large discrepancy between the 2 images. Furthermore, after this moment, the 2 videos resume their perfect synchronization, which is maintained all the way to the end. 2 images. The expert has then proceeded to analyze the 2 frames with the most sophisticated digital tools and has obtained some astonishing results. A series of Boolean subtractions reveals that a small part of the image is actually present in both frames. What is said to be the nose of the airplane in camera 2 is also present as part of the smoke trail in camera 1. It seems in fact as if someone has retouched this area of the frame by means of cut and paste in order to cover the plane, while he has kept the end of the smoke trail to make it look like the nose of the plane entering frame. Question: given that the maximum fluctuation between the two cameras would translate in a difference of 25 feet in the position of the plane, can you provide a valid explanation for the large discrepancy between the two corresponding frames? Absent a valid explanation for this discrepancy, we must conclude that at least one of the two frames is the result of intentional manipulation or photoshopping. The total lack of evidence that the unknown incoming was in fact Flight 77, a mysterious phenomenon that attracted the attention in the opposite direction. The failure from the White House to shoot down the incoming even though it posed a serious and imminent threat. A totally illogical approach maneuver from a terrorist's point of view. An alleged hijacker incapable of performing that maneuver. The absence of any significant part of the plane from the wreckage. A damage to the building clearly incompatible with a 757. A doctored tape of the impact, and the obvious reluctance by the FBI to release any other tape that could allow the identification of the plane.
Conspiracy theories about the 9/11 attack on the Pentagon exploded on the 5th anniversary when a 9/11 commissioner slipped up on national television.
There were many times you were afraid, especially when I was standing in front of the Pentagon that night, seeing one of our fortresses pried open by a missile airplane, pried open by a missile.
Pried open by a missile? Something exploded at the Pentagon. But was it a jetliner? The only bodies found at the scene were Pentagon employees. But there's never been evidence of passengers' bodies being recovered from the Pentagon wreckage. The Flight 77 victims were only identified later at Dover Air Force Base, 104 miles away.
This will be the actual unedited video that I shot that morning.
What's happening here?
Well, this is the first frame I shot. This was about 100 yards from the impact site, or the site of the fire.
Just to stop you a minute.
Yes.
Have you ever been to another plane crash site?
I was at the Air Florida crash in 1980 when it hit the Potomac River, when it took off from Washington National Airport.
And how did that differ from this?
Well, it was identifiable. I mean, the tail was sticking out of the water. There was debris. They actually recovered a lot of the victims still in their seats.
But look how clean the lawn is.
I know.
There is no sign that a plane has been anywhere near this lawn.
I was looking for pieces, anything to identify what I might be looking at. And I saw nothing. No luggage, no wheels, no engines, nothing that resembled an aircraft.
Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline.
Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Northwoods was to take a regularly scheduled commercial airliner and take a similar type plane, paint the tail numbers up to resemble that of the commercial airliner, fly it by remote control out over the Caribbean, and by remote control blow it up after sending a tape-recorded message saying, "Help, we're being attacked by Cuban MiGs." This was in 1962.
In 2005, NIST presented their final report on the collapse of the Twin Towers, and in 2008, the one on Building 7. For the Twin Towers, NIST concluded that they were brought down by the consequences of the impacts and the ensuing fires, while Building 7, according to NIST, was brought down primarily by fire alone. In other words, they fully confirmed the official version by the U.S. government. The other organization to bear weight on the debate has been Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, an association of professionals in civil construction founded in 2006 by San Francisco architect Richard Gage. Architects and Engineers lists over 2,000 experts in structural engineering, science of materials, architectural design, fire protection, science of construction, metallurgy, and even experts in controlled demolitions. Since they've entered the fray, Architects and Engineers has brought to the table a solid amount of scientific information refuting the official explanation by NIST on the collapses and confirming the theory of controlled demolitions instead. At the same time, Architects and Engineers has acted as an unrelenting watchdog for every action taken by NIST, pointing out every single error in their work, and even forcing them, in some cases, to make corrections to their reports.
I think it's something that we need to clarify and correct in the final version of the report. Okay.
We have a real chance at this new world order.
New world order. New world order. New world order. New world order. A new world order. New world order. New world order. New world order.
I believe we, and particularly you, your class, has an incredible window of opportunity to lead in shaping a new world order for the 21st century. New world order.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order. A new world order.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order. When we are successful, and we have a real chance at